Chapter 1. A Day in the Life of an Aztec Garden Keeper. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. No pharaohs, no castles, no powdered wigs, just the quiet, steady rhythm of someone who spent their days in the gardens of an empire that worshipped both beauty and blood. So if you've had a long day, maybe too many meetings, maybe too many thoughts, just sink in, breathe, and let's drift to the Valley of Mexico. Picture a dawn mist rolling over a lake that doesn't exist anymore, birds you've never heard singing names you'll never pronounce, and the sound of a clay pot being set down on damp earth. Welcome to Tenochtitlan, the island city that was once called the Venice of the New World. If Venice had pyramids, ritual heart extractions, and chinampas, those floating gardens that made the city bloom like a dream above water. And somewhere among them, half covered in mud, humming off-key, is our main character tonight. The Aztec Garden Keeper. Not a priest, not a warrior, not a noble. Just one of the hundreds of people who made sure the gods had flowers when they wanted them, which, inconveniently, was always. He wakes up before dawn, of course. The Aztecs had this terrible habit of starting their days before anyone civilized would. The night chill still clings to the water when he rolls out from his mat, rubbing his eyes and trying not to think about the day's labor. His home is small, reed walls, packed earth, thatch roof, and smells like smoke and maize flour. His wife, already awake, is grinding corn on a matate stone, rhythmically, almost like she's drumming the morning into existence. The sound is so normal it doesn't even register anymore. Outside, the air tastes faintly of lake water and ash. Somewhere in the distance, a conch horn sounds from the temple precinct. Not for him, of course, that's for the gods and the people pretending to be gods. He chews a few mouthfuls of yesterday's tlaxcali, flat and cold, then drinks a toll, a thin corn porridge that's somehow both comforting and disappointing. Breakfast in Tenochtitlan was never about indulgence. Unless you were a noble, of course. Then you got cacao and honey and fruit from lands conquered by someone else's sword. But he's not one of those. He's a Masawali, a commoner. The kind of person who made the empire work while the empire barely noticed him. And yet, as he steps out into the watery dawn, you can almost feel a quiet pride there. Because in a city where even the gods demanded bouquets, his work mattered. His chinampa lies a short canoe ride away, a small, rectangular patch of man-made land floating between the canals like a green quilt square. These floating gardens weren't actually floating, but that's just one of those historical exaggerations people keep repeating because it sounds more magical than stabilized mud platform anchored by willow roots. He paddles there with a slow rhythm, passing by others like him. Some are carrying reeds, some fishing, some ferrying market goods. Everyone moves like they've done this forever. The sky is pale orange, the volcanoes still asleep under their veils of cloud. By the time he reaches his chinampa, the mist has lifted enough to reveal what he calls his garden, though it looks more like a small, crowded miracle. Rows of maize, amaranth, beans climbing up stalks, and patches of marigolds and dahlias that shimmer gold in the early light. Some of these flowers are sacred, offerings to the gods. Others are for noble households, whose gardens are more about showing off than survival. He ties his canoe to a branch and steps barefoot onto the damp soil. It's cool, soft, and gives slightly under his weight. The smell, rich, sweet, earthy, is the kind of scent that no modern city can fake. This is where the empire breathes. He starts with the weeds. Always the weeds. They grow like the gods planted them out of spite. Each handful he pulls brings up tiny worms wriggling in the roots. He tosses them aside for the ducks who wait near the edges, well-trained freeloaders who know a gardener's routine better than most priests know their prayers. And while he works, he hums. Not any song you'd recognize. Something older, something half like a lullaby, half like a spell. The Aztecs believed songs and breath carried power. Even the sound of your exhale could feed the gods, if it was done with intention. He whispers a few words to Tlaloc, god of rain. Partly out of respect, mostly out of habit. Everyone did. You didn't risk offending the guy who decided when your crops lived or died. And somewhere behind that soft murmur of faith, there's a quiet superstition that if you forget to say thanks for the water, he might remind you how much you need it. Around mid-morning, other gardeners arrive on neighboring chinampas. You can hear laughter, a few jokes about lazy priests or stingy merchants, and the low splash of paddles. It's the Aztec version of water cooler talk, except instead of gossiping about promotions, they're complaining about ducks eating their beans. Every so often, a noble servant arrives by canoe, carrying baskets. They trade for flowers or herbs, usually with a handful of cacao beans. That's currency, by the way. Real beans, small, bitter, and occasionally chewed by people who couldn't resist the temptation of eating their paycheck. Our gardener doesn't say much during these trades. He's polite, careful, a little reserved. He's learned that nobles don't like too much eye contact from commoners. It's one of those unspoken rules, like not spilling blood on a temple floor unless it's for a good reason. When the merchant leaves, he checks his small pouch, a few beans richer, and a little more hopeful that he might afford new sandals before the rainy season. By midday, the sun burns hard over the valley. You'd think being surrounded by water would cool things down. It doesn't. The chinampas turn into humid, glowing ovens where mosquitoes reign supreme. He takes shelter under a small awning made of woven reeds. Lunch is simple: tamales, maybe a chili or two, and water scooped straight from the canal. It's not exactly clean, but it's his canal. And back then, that was probably the same as being proud of your tap water. Sometimes, he thinks about the city across the water, the heart of Tenochtitlan, where the Tlaloc, the ruler, lives among turquoise walls and obsidian mirrors. He's never seen the palace, but he's heard stories: courtyards with fountains of flowing water, gardens filled with exotic plants from across the empire. And the gardeners there, now those were the lucky ones. They tended flowers that only nobles could touch. He smiles, shaking his head. Luck is relative, he thinks. Those gardeners probably have to listen to nobles debate whether a certain blossom looks regal enough for a god. At least his flowers don't talk back, though he swears some of them do. After resting, he returns to work, trimming, planting, repairing the edges of the chinampa with fresh reeds and mud. It's repetitive, soothing, almost meditative. You lose time doing it. The hands move, the mind drifts. He remembers being a boy, learning from his father how to build the base, driving stakes into the lake bed, layering soil and organic matter, letting it rot and turn fertile. The same patch he works now was his father's before him, and before that his grandfather's. A small, unremarkable inheritance, but one that kept their family fed for generations. And in that slow rhythm of mud and water, you catch a glimpse of something deeper. This isn't just gardening. It's a sacred routine, the quiet maintenance of balance between the gods, the city, and the land. The Aztecs had a word for this kind of harmony, Tlaloc, meaning upon the earth. Everything rested on it. Everything depended on it staying steady. Late afternoon brings a visit from a priest's attendant. The man is thin, severe, and perpetually unimpressed. He collects flower bundles for the temples, specifically marigolds and white lilies. Offerings for an upcoming festival, no doubt. Our gardener bows slightly, ties the flowers neatly, and hands them over with both hands. No words needed. The attendant drops 2 cacao beans in return, which feels a little insulting, but again, the gods don't haggle. As the canoe drifts away, he sighs. 2 beans for a morning's worth of blooms. Still, it's something. And maybe if the gods are pleased, the rains will come on time this year. He stretches, cracks his back, and looks out over the lake. The water reflects the color of the sky, copper and violet now, rippling with the movement of ducks and tiny canoes heading home. It's beautiful in a quiet, unphotographed way. Evening comes slowly in Tenochtitlan. The sun sinks behind the volcanoes, and the city glows in soft gold light. Smoke from cooking fires rises in thin trails, mixing with the scent of roasted maize and flowers. The air cools, and the mosquitoes retreat, mercifully. He gathers his tools, a digging stick, a reed basket, a stone hoe, and loads them into his canoe. The day's fatigue sits heavy but familiar in his body. There's no rush. The city never really sleeps, but its rhythm slows. The sound of paddles becomes almost musical, hundreds of tiny ripples moving together toward the same horizon. As he rows home, he passes a few other boats carrying vegetables, flowers, or passengers too tired to talk. The canal water catches torchlight from the banks, flickering like fireflies. When he reaches home, his wife is waiting with dinner, beans, tortillas, maybe some roasted insects if they're lucky. They eat in companionable silence, occasionally interrupted by the laughter of children playing outside or the distant beat of temple drums. After dinner, he sits outside for a while. The stars above Tenochtitlan are sharp and endless. He can see the faint glow of the great temple in the distance, its twin shrines lit for the gods. He doesn't feel small exactly, just aware that somewhere in that towering empire, people like him keep it alive one basket of flowers at a time. He hums again, softly. The same tune from the morning. Maybe it's gratitude, maybe it's routine. Maybe in his own quiet way, it's prayer. And as the night deepens, you realize this, that the grandeur of empires isn't built only by kings, warriors, or priests. It's built by gardeners who know when to plant and when to rest. Because even in the most powerful city of its time, someone had to make sure the gods had flowers. Chapter 2, The Emperor's Garden, where beauty served the gods. Across the water from the chinampas, beyond the reed huts, the muddy banks, and the chatter of the city markets, there was another kind of garden. One that didn't exist to feed anyone, or to please a humble god with flowers and prayers. No, this one existed for a man who didn't have to till his own soil. The Emperor's Garden, or as the nobles like to call it, the House of Flowers. Because apparently when you control an empire, modesty is optional. This is where Montezuma, or Motokuzoma Zokoyatsun, if we're being respectful, liked to walk at dawn, pretending to be deep in thought while priests followed behind him, holding things he would never actually carry himself. Let's picture it for a moment. Tenochtitlan, shining under the morning sun, its causeways stretching across the lake like ribbons of light. And at its edge, near the southern district, lies the royal gardens, a maze of terraces, ponds, aviaries, and flower beds so carefully designed it would make a Renaissance landscape architect quietly weep into his parchment. The air here is different. Not the earthy scent of chinampas, but something curated, perfumed by hundreds of species of flowers and herbs, all collected from across the empire. Some are from the mountains, some from tropical valleys, some from the lands of conquered peoples who had little choice but to send tribute in the form of plants that would die if you looked at them wrong. And at the center of all this, the emperor's personal collection. Plants so rare they had their own attendants. Flowers that no one but Montezuma was allowed to pick. Because what's the point of absolute power if you can't gatekeep the orchids? The garden is alive with sound. Not chaotic like the city, more choreographed. There are parrots calling from gilded cages, frogs croaking from ornamental ponds, and fountains trickling through channels carved from volcanic stone. Fountains. In a city built on a lake, they still went out of their way to make water move in artistic ways, because symbolism mattered. Flowing water was divine. It connected the mortal and the sacred. It whispered of Tlaloc's generosity, and also of human ingenuity, the kind that thought, why not pipe spring water across miles of causeway just to keep the emperor's pet fish comfortable? And there were fish. Dozens of species. Tiny ones that glimmered like moving jewels, and larger ones brought from the warm rivers of the south. Some say Montezuma liked to feed them himself, probably while wearing gold ornaments and an expression of deep, philosophical sadness, the kind rulers cultivated when they needed to look like they were burdened by destiny. The garden keepers here weren't like the humble chinampa farmers. They were specialists, trained horticulturalists, some even from noble families, assigned to maintain the sacred symmetry of the emperor's paradise. They knew which flowers opened at dawn and which bloomed at dusk. They knew which herbs could calm the body and which ones might kill you if you steeped them too long. Their knowledge was respected, though never quite rewarded. You could be an expert in soil pH and still have to bow to a noble who thought flowers grew by prayer alone. Still, they took pride in their work, because this wasn't just a garden. It was the empire in miniature. Every plant, every petal, represented a conquered region. Keeping them alive was a political act, a living map of domination disguised as beauty. And then there were the birds. So many birds that the emperor had entire sections of the garden dedicated to them. There were scarlet macaws, eagles, quetzal with feathers long enough to make a fashion designer faint, and hummingbirds so tiny they were kept in warm, covered enclosures at night. Feathers were sacred in the Aztec world, symbols of divinity and light. Warriors wore them into battle, priests used them in rituals, and artisans spent weeks crafting mosaics so delicate that one sneeze could undo an entire masterpiece. But the real irony? The emperor never wore quetzal feathers casually. They were far too precious. So the birds just lived in luxury, fluttering around, shedding feathers that would one day adorn an idol or crown. It's the ancient equivalent of having a closet full of couture you'll never wear. Let's drift a little closer to Montezuma himself. Imagine him, tall, solemn, dressed in cotton so fine it would make silk blush. He moves slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they know everyone is watching. His sandals don't touch the dirt. Attendants lay cloths ahead of his steps, replacing them after each pass. Because apparently, soil contact was for peasants. He stops by a pond, watching fish ripple through the water. A priest murmurs something about omens. Montezuma nods gravely, as though the fish's swimming pattern might indeed reveal the fate of the empire. Maybe it did. Or maybe he just enjoyed pretending it did. His gaze shifts to a cluster of lilies, white, flawless, arranged so perfectly they look unnatural. He gestures, and a servant immediately plucks one, lays it on a jade plate, and offers it back to him. Montezuma stares at it for a moment, then turns away. The flower will be placed in the temple later, as an offering to Tlaloc or perhaps Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty and love. Because here, even indifference was ritualized. The emperor's daily stroll was more than vanity. It was performance. A quiet theater of power where nothing was accidental. The order of the plants, the placement of the ponds, the songs of the birds, everything whispered of cosmic harmony. To walk through it was to walk through the empire itself, structured, lush, and slightly terrifying in its perfection. And the gardeners, always just out of sight, moved like ghosts. Sweeping paths, pruning branches, arranging stones in symbolic patterns. They spoke little, breathed carefully, and tried not to draw attention. Because the emperor noticing you could mean praise or punishment, and it was hard to tell which one would ruin your life faster. One of them, an older man named Quatli, had been tending the emperor's garden for 30 years. He'd seen 3 rulers come and go, and he'd learned that plants were far easier to manage than politics. He was responsible for the medicinal section of the garden, a place where herbs grew in tidy, fragrant rows. Sage, mint, marigold, aloe, and hundreds of others with names that even modern botanists struggle to pronounce. The Aztecs were obsessed with herbal medicine. Every leaf had a purpose, every root a secret. Priests and healers came here to collect ingredients for salves, infusions, and rituals. And Quatli, stooped and sun-browned, knew which plant cured stomach aches and which one made you see the gods too vividly. He didn't talk much about his work. But once, when a young novice asked him how he remembered all the uses, he just smiled and said, "The plants tell me." The boy laughed. Quatli didn't. As afternoon stretched over the garden, music drifted faintly from the palace. Drums, flutes, rattles, the constant background hum of imperial life. Somewhere, a feast was being prepared. Somewhere else, someone was probably being sacrificed for it. The garden didn't react. It never did. That was its magic, its refusal to acknowledge the noise of human ambition. Even the birds seemed immune to politics. They sang for no one, groomed their feathers, and watched emperors come and go. When you live in a cage of gold, even power looks small. Quatli watered his herbs, muttering prayers not to gods, but to the plants themselves. His hands moved with the calm of repetition. He'd seen droughts, floods, festivals, and funerals. The empire had grown richer, then hungrier. The emperor more distant, the omens more ominous. And still, the lilies bloomed on schedule. Sometimes, Montezuma summoned the gardeners directly. Not often. He preferred his flowers obedient and his servants invisible. But on rare occasions, curiosity won. One morning, word came that the emperor wished to speak with Quatli. The old man knelt in the garden court, his forehead nearly touching the ground. He could feel the heat of the sun bouncing off the polished stone. Montezuma appeared in silence, as if materialized from incense smoke. His voice was calm, deep, measured. "I've heard," he said, "that the herbs in your care have no rivals." Quatli didn't answer. Compliments from rulers were like storms, unpredictable, occasionally fatal. Montezuma gestured toward a cluster of flowering shrubs. "Tell me," he asked, "do these plants speak to you?" The pause. "Yes, my lord," Quatli said finally. "What do they say?" "That they wish to live, and that they will do so until they are taken." The emperor stared at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "As do we all." Then he walked away. The conversation was over. Quatli returned to his herbs. The plants, he thought, had been right again. The royal garden wasn't just for leisure. It was a statement, a living embodiment of control. A world in miniature, where nature itself bowed to the empire. Every blossom was tribute, every tree a record of conquest. And yet, beneath the layers of order and beauty, there was always something fragile. The slightest drought, the smallest pest, could undo months of perfection. Perhaps that's why Montezuma walked here so often, surrounded by beauty, haunted by impermanence. He must have known, deep down, that empires are just gardens on a larger scale. They grow, they bloom, and eventually, they wither. But not today. Today, the flowers still opened when he passed. The birds still sang their borrowed songs. And the gardeners, unseen, kept everything alive. As twilight crept across Tenochtitlan, the emperor's procession moved back toward the palace. Servants carried incense burners, guards cleared paths, and priests whispered prayers. Behind them, the garden fell silent. The parrots tucked their heads under their wings. The fountains slowed to a trickle. And in the cool shadows, Quatli placed his tools aside and watched the stars appear above the temple towers. He thought about the old gods, the ones who fed on hearts and blood, yet demanded flowers too. He thought about the emperor, weighed down by gold and omens. And he thought about the small, invisible roots beneath his feet, holding the whole illusion together. Tomorrow he would wake before dawn. He would water, prune, and whisper to the plants again. And maybe they'd whisper back. Because somewhere between the soil and the stars, someone had to keep the empire's beauty breathing. Morning again, though this time the city is already humming before the sun's even finished stretching over the mountains. The lake glitters faintly, the air smells faintly of smoke and damp reeds, and Tenochtitlan's twin city, Tlaloc, is about to wake into its favorite ritual, the market. This isn't just any market. It's the market, the beating, bustling, slightly chaotic heart of Aztec commerce. Imagine a space big enough to hold tens of thousands of people, traders, buyers, nobles pretending to be down to earth, and a few pickpockets perfecting their craft. A city within a city built entirely around exchange. And at its colorful center, tucked between the maize sellers, the spice merchants, and the jade traders, blooms one of the most beloved corners of all, the flower market. If you could walk through it, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the noise, or the haggling, or even the faint odor of smoked fish drifting from somewhere nearby. It would be the color. Every shade of red, orange, yellow, white, packed tightly together in bundles, garlands, woven crowns, and clay vases. The ground looks like a painted rug, and the air feels like it's breathing perfume. The Aztecs didn't just like flowers. They lived in them, worshipped with them, and measured their lives by their bloom. A wedding? Flowers. A birth? Flowers. A festival? Even more flowers. A sacrifice? You guessed it, flowers. And if you were short on offerings, the gods might forgive you, as long as you brought enough marigolds. Our main seller this morning is a woman named Malinal, which means the twisting herb. Her name fits. She's small, wiry, and always in motion, braiding stems, rearranging colors, calling out to customers with that blend of warmth and mild sarcasm only seasoned market people have. Her family has been in the flower trade for 3 generations, which in Aztec time is practically forever. Her father used to deliver garlands to the temple district, and her mother wove floral headdresses for brides who couldn't afford gold. Malinal's stall is nothing fancy. A mat laid on the ground, baskets filled with dahlias, marigolds, and white lilies, and a clay bowl filled with fresh-cut stems floating in water. But her eye for arrangement is legendary. She mixes colors like poetry, bright next to pale, soft next to bold. Even nobles send servants to her stall with quiet instructions. Right now, she's arguing with a merchant who insists her marigolds are smaller than last week's. "They're not smaller," she says, barely looking up. "You've just grown richer eyes." The man frowns, then laughs, and pays her anyway. That's how she wins. Not with charm, exactly, but with that subtle confidence of someone who knows her flowers will outlast your complaints. All around her, the market pulses. There are no stalls made of wood or metal, just mats, baskets, and human noise. People barter with cacao beans, cloth, obsidian tools, and copper bells. The smell of roasting maize mixes with copal incense, and the heat rises like invisible silk. A boy passes by carrying cages of live hummingbirds, their wings blurring like tiny prayers. They're bound for temple altars or noble homes, where they'll be kept as living ornaments until, well, they stop living. The Aztecs were many things, but gentle with beauty wasn't always one of them. Still the birds sing. The flowers gleam, and Malinal sits cross-legged among them like a priestess of petals. A noblewoman approaches, tall, deliberate, wrapped in cotton dyed with cochineal red, a color so expensive that you could buy a small house for the same price. She doesn't speak directly to Malinal. Instead, her attendant kneels and points at a basket of lilies. "For the lady's bath," the servant says. "She wants only the ones that have never touched the sun." Malinal lifts her brows slightly, pretending not to roll her eyes. Then the lady should have sent for moonlight instead. Still, she picks the lilies carefully, ones just opened, pale and unblemished. She places them in a bundle wrapped in maize husk, hands them over, and waits. The servant counts 10 cacao beans into her palm, generous payment for something that will wilt by evening. The noblewoman doesn't say thank you. None of them do. But that's fine. Flowers don't need gratitude, just water and quiet hands. Behind Malinal's stall, 2 older women are weaving garlands for a coming festival. Their fingers move fast, looping, tucking, tying. One of them hums softly, an old ritual tune that's been sung so many times it's lost all its original meaning. They're making zakimikatl, flower ropes meant to decorate altars and doorways. Each color means something: red for sacrifice, white for purity, yellow for sunlight, blue for water. The Aztecs saw flowers as the earth's laughter, temporary but divine. Malinal pauses for a moment, watching them work. She thinks of her own daughter, 8 years old, who helps her tie bundles in the evenings. She wonders if the girl will love flowers too, or if she'll run from them the first chance she gets. It's a sweet life, but not an easy one. The beauty doesn't last. Nothing does. At noon, the market reaches its loudest hour. Drums from the nearby temple echo faintly through the noise. Vendors shout prices, buyers haggle, and children dart between baskets like sparrows. A priest walks by, inspecting flower offerings for an upcoming ritual. His robe is white, embroidered with symbols of maize and rain. He selects a few marigold garlands and hands over a jade bead, far more than they're worth. Malinal bows slightly, not out of reverence, but respect for good business. The priest thanks her and moves on, his sandals leaving faint prints in the dust. She looks at the jade bead in her palm, smooth, cool, and far too precious for a flower seller. She tucks it away, maybe to trade later for maize, or a better mat, or new sandals for her daughter. The sun climbs higher. The petals start to droop. She sprinkles them with water, whispering apologies to the wilting ones. It's not superstition. It's habit. Flowers die fast in the heat, and talking to them feels like an old friend's comfort before goodbye. There's a rhythm to this market life, an unspoken order under the chaos. Everyone knows their place, their prices, their timing. The wealthy shop early, before the crowds. Commoners fill in after, trading leftovers for scraps. By late afternoon, the air is thick and warm, and the market begins to fade like a song's last note. People pack up their mats, scoop their cacao beans into pouches, and paddle home across the canals. Malinal stays a little longer. She always does. There are unsold blossoms, and she can't bear to throw them into the canal. Instead, she weaves them into small wreaths and leaves them by the temple steps, gifts to the gods, or maybe to herself. She's not religious in the priestly sense. But like most people in Tenochtitlan, she believes in exchange. Give the world beauty, and maybe it'll give you another sunrise. When she finally packs up, the market square is a carpet of petals and footprints. The scent of crushed flowers lingers in the air, sweet, tired, and faintly melancholic. She loads her baskets into a canoe, ties it loose from the bank, and drifts through the evening canals. The city glows behind her, torches reflecting in the water like floating suns. The paddling is slow, rhythmic. She passes other boats, other vendors, and the occasional noble canoe, larger, lacquered, and far too quiet. Somewhere nearby, someone singing. A fisherman, maybe. Or a child. The tune carries easily over water, thin but warm. Malinal hums along, softly. Her home is a small hut near the edge of the Chinampa district, reeds, mud walls, a roof that leaks if you ask it to. Her daughter runs to meet her, barefoot, holding a small clay figure of a duck she made that morning. "Did you sell all the flowers?" the girl asks. "Almost," Malinal says, smiling. "The rest I gave to the gods. They were tired too." The girl laughs, the kind of laugh that could make a whole empire feel briefly forgiven. Dinner is simple: maize cakes, beans, and chili. The canal outside glows with moonlight. Somewhere across the water, drums beat softly from the temple, a slow rhythm marking the evening's sacrifice. Malinal doesn't look. She's seen enough of gods and their appetite. Instead, she looks at the single flower her daughter placed in a cup by the door. A dahlia, slightly crooked, its petals half open. It's perfect. Later, when her daughter's asleep, Malinal steps outside. The night smells like rain and ash. The stars hang low, sharp and bright over the lake. She sits by the water's edge, feet dangling in the cool ripples. She thinks about the people who buy her flowers. Nobles who'll forget them by evening, priests who'll burn them in offering, lovers who'll throw them into canals after arguments. And still, she sells them. Still, she wakes early and ties them into bundles. Because someone has to. Someone has to remind the city that beauty, however brief, still matters. The empire's poets used to say that flowers were the only truth the gods allowed humans to hold. Everything else, gold, power, even life, was temporary illusion. But flowers were honest. They never pretended to last. In the distance, she can hear a temple chant drifting across the lake. Words about dawn, renewal, and sacrifice. The same things always. She's not sure if they comfort her or not. She dips her fingers in the canal and traces circles in the water, watching them spread and fade. The ripples catch the moonlight, turning her reflection into fragments. She whispers a line she's heard before, from a poem recited by a wandering singer in the market: "We only borrow this earth for a moment. The flowers borrow it less." And maybe that's all there is to say. Back in Tlaloc, the market square lies quiet under the stars. Stray petals float in the canals, drifting toward the lake like tiny boats. Tomorrow, there'll be more flowers, more noise, more trade. The same rhythm, the same pulse. Somewhere, the emperor will walk his garden paths. Somewhere else, a temple will burn marigolds for the gods. And in the middle of it all, Malinal will wake, stretch, and begin again, tying stems, braiding color, turning the briefness of life into something beautiful enough to sell. Chapter 4. The Gardens That Fed Gods and Emperors. Let's float onward, through the misty dawn of Tenochtitlan once more, where the hum of the city fades, replaced by the rhythmic slap of sandals on stone and the occasional trill of a bird perched in the woven reeds. The garden keeper, whose life we've been quietly tracing, begins his fourth day as if time doesn't really exist, because in the Aztec world, it doesn't flow in a straight line. It circles. It returns. It grows and decays in the same motion. And in that cycle, gardens weren't just places to grow food, they were miniature reflections of the cosmos. Every patch of earth had meaning, every leaf a story, every flower a sacrifice in disguise. The palace gardens of the Tlaloc, the emperor, were not simple plots of green. They were sprawling ecosystems, carefully curated to echo the divine order. Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco, famously designed his gardens to represent the harmony between water, earth, and the gods. He once built aqueducts and artificial hills, not because he had to, but because he could. He wanted to demonstrate that man could, in some way, imitate the creative force of the divine. For our quiet gardener, though, that grand cosmic symbolism translated to a lot of mud, bugs, and back pain. Every morning, he waded through irrigation canals that shimmered like liquid mirrors. He'd check the floating beds, chinampas, to make sure the roots hadn't rotted overnight. The Aztecs were geniuses at turning swampy chaos into productive paradise. Wooden stakes, mud dredged from the lake, woven reeds, layer by layer until a floating farm emerged. A miracle of engineering, really. But to him, it was just another day making sure the amaranth didn't drown. He'd stop sometimes to watch the reflections of passing clouds ripple through the canals, his calloused hands trailing through the cool water. Maybe he'd think of how this was once nothing but marshland before the gods, or perhaps more accurately, the city planners, decided it would be reborn as the capital of an empire. And above all this, literally above, in the palace terraces, were the emperor's private gardens. This was where flowers bloomed that commoners could never touch. Some petals were used only for ceremonies, others for perfumes worn by priests and noblewomen. The gardener would occasionally be summoned up there, an intimidating event. The palace guards, feathered and silent, would part just enough to let him enter. He'd kneel, replace a dying blossom, rearrange stones, and leave without a word. He knew better than to linger. After all, these were sacred spaces. To spend too long there might tempt the gods, or the priests, to notice him too closely. Back on the lower terraces, work was less mystical and more damp. He'd prune cacao plants that would eventually become tribute chocolate, stir compost that steamed gently under the sun, and whisper to the maize as if encouraging it to stand taller. The Aztecs believed that crops listened. You didn't shout at corn. You coaxed it. Sometimes, in the quiet lull of late afternoon, when the city's bustle softened to a low hum, he'd overhear the distant sounds of ritual. The beating of drums from the great temple. The murmurs of prayers. The occasional scream that followed. But even that, he'd learned to tune out. To him, it was background noise, like the wind or the croak of frogs. His focus remained the same: keep the water flowing, keep the plants alive, keep the gods content through chlorophyll and care. The gardens weren't only about aesthetics, they were living systems of tribute and status. The Aztec elite measured wealth in the number of exotic plants they could cultivate. Orchids from the mountains, herbs from the valleys, and rare blossoms brought by merchants who risked bandits and snakes to deliver them. Some of these plants didn't even grow well in the basin, but that didn't stop anyone from trying. Because nothing said, divine ruler, like having flowers that shouldn't logically exist in your climate. And our gardener? He was the one forced to figure out how to keep them alive. There's a certain absurdity in that, isn't there? The empire was obsessed with the appearance of cosmic order, but behind it all were people constantly improvising, patching leaks, fighting pests, rearranging stones after a storm. The divine garden was, in truth, one gust of wind away from chaos. Yet it always appeared perfect. Because that was his job, to make sure it did. When dusk began to fall, he'd pause to watch the sun dip below the mountains. The lake turned gold, then violet, then black. The air cooled, and the canals breathed mist. Sometimes he'd catch the faint scent of copal incense drifting from the temple precinct. It mixed oddly with the earthy smell of wet soil, creating a perfume both divine and mundane. He'd stretch his back, glance over the rows of flowers glowing faintly in the fading light, and allow himself the smallest, most private smile. No one would ever thank him. His name would never be carved in stone or sung by poets. But still, every petal, every grain, every shimmering reflection in the garden water was, in its way, a testament to his hands. Let's drift, slowly, into another dawn. The empire breathes. The lake whispers. The gods demand more beauty. And the gardener, our quiet, steady witness to it all, rises once again to meet them. Because in Tenochtitlan, even ordinary men served eternity with their shovels. Chapter 5. Feeding the gods with flowers. By the time the next dawn crept across Lake Texcoco, the city was already breathing again. Steam from the canals, smoke from the hearths, and the faint, rhythmic beat of distant drums. For most people, the day began with food or prayer. For the garden keeper, it began with negotiation. Not with people, those were easy enough to ignore, but with the earth itself. Because every patch of soil in the Aztec world had a personality. And some mornings, it woke up in a bad mood. He'd step into the garden barefoot, as custom demanded before touching sacred plants. The mud was cool, spongy, slightly metallic. He'd kneel, scoop up a handful, and whisper something under his breath, not quite a prayer, more like a weary greeting. You didn't order the earth to grow. You asked politely. The gods were listening after all, and so were the plants. To us, it might sound poetic. To him, it was just good insurance. If the maize didn't sprout properly, the priest would come looking for someone to blame. And the gods were angry was not the kind of performance review anyone wanted. So he made his rounds like a man tending to a shrine. Each cluster of herbs, epizode, amaranth, chia, had its own tiny offering. Maybe a pinch of maize flour, maybe a drop of pulque, maybe a whispered joke if the gardener was feeling brave. Humor was, after all, one way to keep the gods entertained. He'd sometimes think about how absurd it all was, that in a city built by engineers capable of moving mountains, no one dared plant a flower without asking permission from invisible forces. Yet it worked. The crops grew, the lakes shimmered, and the empire fed millions. Maybe the absurdity was the secret. At midday, he'd make his way to a small shrine tucked at the edge of the garden. It was nothing grand, just a worn stone figure of Zacapili, the flower prince. Patron of beauty, poetry, and ecstatic visions. A god with a slightly smug smile carved into his face, as if permanently amused by human effort. In front of that figure, the gardener would set a small offering, fresh marigolds, crushed cacao, sometimes a butterfly caught accidentally in a bloom. Offerings didn't have to be grand. The gods were said to value sincerity over spectacle, though one suspects the priests disagreed. After the ritual, he'd return to his work, trimming vines and untangling roots. Occasionally, the high priest's assistants would appear, solemn, perfumed, and disturbingly clean for people who lived in a swamp. They'd request flowers for ceremonies, or reeds for decoration, or simply inspect the grounds to ensure everything was pleasing to the eyes of the gods. He never looked them in the eyes for long. Too much eye contact with someone in a feathered headdress could turn into extra duties. Or worse, an invitation to help with the ceremony. And help, in Aztec religious terms, could mean anything from sweeping the temple steps to standing very still while someone chanted ominously near your neck. The gardener much preferred dirt under his fingernails to ritual blood on his tunic. Sometimes, though, he couldn't avoid the ceremonies entirely. When major festivals arrived, like Tenochtitlan or Panquetzalisli, flowers became currency. He'd be tasked with weaving massive garlands to drape across idols, or preparing symbolic flower bundles to accompany offerings. The air would fill with the scent of hundreds of blossoms, their bright petals masking the iron tang of sacrifice that inevitably followed. He'd never admit it, but he found a strange calm in those moments. The ritual chaos had rhythm. The drums echoed like heartbeats. The priest's chants rose and fell in tones that almost sounded like wind. It was hypnotic, terrible but beautiful. And when it ended, when the smoke cleared and the crowds drifted away, he'd return to the garden, where the real living things still breathed. The flowers that hadn't been picked. The plants still wet with dew. The quiet hum of bees reclaiming the silence. He'd take a deep breath, hands on his knees, and mutter something like, "Well, that's enough holiness for one day." Then back to the canals. Back to the floating beds. Back to the sacred monotony. There was a strange kind of serenity in knowing that your work kept both the gods and the people fed. The Aztec gardener lived between two hungers, divine and human, and somehow managed to satisfy both, at least most of the time. But the balance was delicate. One failed crop, one bad omen, one storm at the wrong hour, and the garden could turn from paradise to punishment. So he stayed cautious, respectful, but always a little skeptical. He'd heard the stories, of course, that when the gods were displeased, they sent plagues of insects, floods, or frost. He'd also noticed that most of those disasters happened when someone important had made a political mistake. Yet somehow, it was always the earth that got blamed. It was easier, after all, to sacrifice a few flowers than to question a priest. As the day wound down, he sat by the edge of a canal, legs dangling over the water. The reflection of the sky shimmered orange, pink, and eventually gray. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. The city beyond the garden glowed with firelight, faint music, and the chatter of distant markets. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and murmured a short prayer. Not to the gods, this time, but to the plants themselves. Something like, "Stay alive, and I'll do the same." Because in a city where faith, politics, and nature were all tangled like vines, maybe that was the most practical religion of all. Chapter 6: The Emperor's Floating Garden. The summons came at dawn, as most unpleasant summonses do. He was knee-deep in canal water, sorting through soggy reeds and grumbling to himself about snails, when a palace messenger arrived. The man was dressed in spotless white cotton, the kind that never seemed to touch dirt no matter how much wind blew. His sandals didn't even squeak. He carried a small obsidian plaque, its edges gleaming faintly in the mist. That alone was enough to make the gardener straighten up, mud and all. The message was simple: the emperor requires your hands. Not your presence. Not your service. Your hands. Which, as phrasing went, was both flattering and slightly alarming. He knew what it meant, of course. The imperial gardens, those rarefied floating sanctuaries where the emperor of the Mexica, Huey Tlatonii himself, walked among lilies and orchids, required tending. And that was not a task to be refused. So he washed as best he could in the canal, changed into his least-stained tunic, and followed the silent messenger through the causeways. Tenochtitlan looked different from that perspective, rising like a mirage from the lake, its temples piercing the morning haze, the sound of paddles slapping water echoing like heartbeats. Markets were waking, priests chanting, soldiers training. But beyond all of that, hidden from the common noise, were the emperor's gardens, sacred spaces of engineered perfection. The floating garden of the palace, known to some as Tezcatzingo, was a marvel, a mountain reshaped by men and water. Terraces stacked like emerald staircases, fountains fed by miles of aqueducts, stone basins overflowing with lilies and colored fish. Every bloom had a meaning, every pool a story. The emperor had ordered the landscape to mimic paradise itself, a heaven on earth, watered by the labor of thousands. And now, apparently, one very nervous gardener. He arrived to find two overseers already waiting, both wearing headdresses shaped like small birds. One was tall and unreadable. The other had that particular smile reserved for people who enjoy finding fault in others. They inspected his hands, calloused, cracked, honest, and seemed pleased. Or at least not displeased. "You'll tend the awakatl trees," said the taller one. "The emperor likes them green all year." Of course he did. The gardener bowed, murmured agreement, and got to work. The awakatl, or avocado, was a delicate tree. Its roots disliked too much water, but its leaves wilted under too little. The irony of maintaining such a plant in the middle of a lake was not lost on him. He trimmed, mulched, whispered encouragement. He moved like a ghost, silent, careful not to step on the patterned stones shaped into the glyph of Tlaloc, the rain god. One misplaced footprint there could earn a reprimand that lasted generations. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of the emperor himself. Montezuma II, perhaps, or one of his predecessors, it hardly mattered. The ruler walked slowly along the terraces, trailed by priests and attendants, speaking softly of omens and tribute. He rarely looked at the gardeners. Why would he? They were background noise, part of the living scenery. But once he did. The gardener was pruning the edge of a flower bed when he felt the air shift, that quiet ripple that happens when too much attention gathers in one place. He looked up and found Montezuma standing a few paces away, hands clasped behind his back, eyes distant but focused. The emperor said nothing for a long while. Then, almost lazily, he gestured toward a blooming cluster of scarlet flowers. "Those," he said, "they please the gods." The gardener nodded, unsure if a response was expected. The emperor's expression didn't change. "See that they never fade," he added and turned away. That was it. A sentence that became both a command and a quiet curse. Because keeping flowers from fading in the heat of Tenochtitlan was not only impossible, it was heretical to even admit it was impossible. From that moment, the gardener's life became an endless struggle against time and sunlight. Every wilted petal felt like a divine test. Every dry stem, an omen of punishment. He began rising earlier, working longer, whispering more prayers to Zacapili than he ever had before. He experimented, mixing lake mud with crushed shells for moisture, shading certain blossoms with woven mats. It helped. Some days. Other days, nothing did. But in the strange way of Aztec life, failure wasn't measured in results, only in devotion. So as long as he looked reverent while replanting the same flowers again and again, no one questioned him. The emperor believed, the priests performed, and the garden remained, eternally blooming, eternally dying, eternally reborn. There were moments, though, when he allowed himself to admire the illusion. At sunset, the terraces glowed gold and crimson. The aqueducts shimmered like rivers of glass. The air smelled of orchids, sage, and distant incense. From afar, it really did look divine. He sometimes wondered if the gods felt envy that mortals had recreated paradise so convincingly without them. But then he'd remember the sacrifices, the offerings, the fear woven into every petal, and think, no, the gods had their fingerprints everywhere. By nightfall, when torches flickered along the terraces and frogs began their patient singing, the gardener would return to his quarters by the canal. He'd lie on his mat, arms aching, and dream of simpler gardens, ones that didn't need to flatter emperors or gods. Just earth and water and quiet. But morning always came, and with it, the sound of a messenger's sandals on stone. Another inspection, another command, another round of eternal flowers. The empire demanded perfection, and the gardener, humble, invisible, half asleep, supplied it one leaf at a time. Because in Tenochtitlan, beauty wasn't just for pleasure. It was proof that the universe still obeyed the will of men. And as long as the gardens bloomed, no one dared to say otherwise. Chapter 7. The Garden of Remedies and Quiet Magic. The next morning smelled of smoke and wet earth, which, in the Aztec basin, meant business as usual. The rains had passed in the night, leaving everything slick and humming. Frogs croaked from the canal edges, and the lake reflected a sky so still it looked like obsidian. Our gardener, yawning and slightly stiff from yesterday's imperial perfectionism, started his rounds again. But this time, he wasn't alone. A pair of women stood waiting at the garden's edge, wrapped in shawls dyed with indigo and ochre. One carried a basket filled with clay jars, the other, a bundle of herbs tied together with maguey fiber. He recognized them immediately: Tlaloc, the healers, the keepers of remedies, midwives, herbalists, and sometimes, if rumors were to be believed, quiet magicians. They greeted him politely, with the calm confidence of people who didn't need permission to exist. Their work was older than emperors, older than the city itself. "We're here for his takpatli," one said, the white-leafed plant used for easing fever. He nodded, led them to the shaded rows near the canal bank. The leaves glistened from last night's rain, curling slightly at the edges like shy tongues. The women crouched, examined the plants, murmured among themselves. One plucked a few carefully, whispering something under her breath as she did, a prayer, or maybe a recipe. With healers, it was often both. In Aztec gardens, medicine and superstition shared the same soil. He watched them work and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that priests could spill blood to please gods, while healers used petals and roots to please the body, and both were considered divine acts. The empire, he mused, was full of contradictions dressed in feathers. As they moved through the garden, they named each plant softly, almost affectionately. Tlacocanali for burns, Quapatli for stomach pains, Yatli for calming restless spirits, or restless children, depending on who you asked. The gardener knew their practical uses, they knew the personalities. Each herb, they said, had moods. Some worked best if picked before dawn. Others resented being harvested under a full moon. And though he didn't always believe it, he never argued. The women had eyes that made you feel they could see your thoughts wilt. One of them, older, with streaks of gray in her hair, looked up at him as she filled her basket. "The emperor's garden," she said, "has too many flowers and not enough medicine." He chuckled softly. "I tend what they tell me to." "Of course," she replied. "But the gods prefer balance. Beauty without healing is an illness of its own." He thought about that for a while. It lingered in his mind like a seed that refused to die. After they left, he wandered through the medicinal beds alone, his fingers brushing over the damp leaves. The air smelled faintly of sage, crushed mint, and earth, the kind of scent that makes you forget empires exist. He knelt beside a row of tzompantli flowers, tiny white blossoms that legend said could cure headaches caused by too much divine noise, or too much priestly chanting, which might have been the same thing. He plucked a few and tucked them behind his ear, half in jest. It didn't cure anything, but it made him feel slightly braver. Later in the day, another healer returned, this time a man, barefoot and humming. He carried a bundle of dried herbs and a small clay censer. The gardener watched as he lit it, sending up curls of fragrant smoke. "For the garden," the man explained simply. "To remind it to stay alive." He circled the rows, fanning smoke over the plants, muttering in a low, steady voice. It wasn't exactly prayer, more like conversation, as if the plants were old friends, stubborn but loyal. The gardener found it oddly comforting, because beneath all the ceremony, the empire's towering temples, and the endless rituals of blood and gold, there was this: people talking to plants, coaxing them to grow, trusting them to heal. The quiet side of Aztec devotion, rooted not in fear, but in care. That evening, as the sky bruised purple and the frogs began their song again, he sat by the canal with a small bowl of water. He floated a few petals on its surface, not as an offering, but as a test. If they drifted east, it meant good weather tomorrow. If they sank, well, the gods were in a mood again. They drifted east. He smiled faintly. "Good," he murmured. "I've got enough moods in the garden already." From the far terraces, he could hear faint music, the emperor's priests chanting for Tlaloc, calling for rain, as if rain ever needed much persuasion in the basin. The irony wasn't lost on him. While they prayed, he patched leaks. And so the cycle continued, the priests with their clouds, the healers with their herbs, and the gardener with his mud. Each one believing their way kept the empire alive. But in truth, it was all the same ritual, the same ancient rhythm of tending, hoping, and pretending control over forces that didn't need permission. As night fell, he lit a small lamp, its flame trembling in the wind, and whispered to no one in particular. "Grow, heal, survive. That's all any of us do." And with that, he lay back, listening to the quiet buzz of insects as the garden breathed beside him, a living lullaby in the middle of an empire that mistook its fragility for eternity. Chapter 8. The Price of Beauty. Morning again. Always morning. Always the sound of paddles cutting through the lake and traders calling from the causeways. The world of Tenochtitlan woke with the rhythm of commerce, tribute boats gliding like slow-moving constellations, piled high with maize, feathers, and, of course, flowers. The gardener sat on a low wall near the water's edge, sipping a cup of thin atoll, watching it all drift past like a dream. He didn't go to the markets often. His work was too sacred or too mundane, depending on who you asked, to mingle with the chatter of sellers and buyers. But lately, the palace gardens had been consuming flowers faster than they grew, and he'd been ordered to acquire more. That phrase, as usual, meant, find them somewhere and don't ask questions. So today, he went to the great market of Tlaloc. Even by Aztec standards, it was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people gathered on broad stone platforms, each selling something: fish, obsidian, cacao, carved idols, dyed cloth. The air was a jumble of smells: chili, honey, sweat, and damp reed mats. But the flower sellers were easy to find. You just followed the scent. They sat in long rows, their stalls overflowing with color: marigolds, dahlias, orchids, and strange hybrids from the far edges of the empire. The blossoms were stacked in neat pyramids, shimmering in the sun like painted offerings. Women arranged them with the precision of priests, each stem trimmed to a perfect angle. "Palace order?" one of them asked when she saw him approach. He hesitated. "Yes. The emperor's gardens need fresh supply." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "They always do." He smiled awkwardly. She handed him a bundle of lilies wrapped in woven palm, the scent sharp and clean. "These came from the southern marshes," she said. "Tell your emperor the flowers down there still bloom without permission." He nodded, unsure if that was meant as praise or rebellion. Probably both. As he moved from stall to stall, he realized that most of these sellers weren't simply merchants. They were tribute collectors, middlemen in a delicate system that funneled color and fragrance toward the capital. Flowers from distant provinces, paid for not in coin but in labor. Entire villages were required to send their best blossoms every moon cycle, carefully packed in wet moss, ferried by canoe through miles of canals. Beauty had an economy, one as strict as any tax ledger. The gardener ran his fingers along a garland of Tenochtitlan flowers, remembering how often he'd seen them draped over idols or tied to the emperor's throne. They looked divine, but he could almost see the hands that picked them, sunburnt, trembling, probably tired. It struck him then. He spent his days making gardens look effortless, but nothing about them was. Every petal carried a weight, of tribute, of labor, of expectation. A flower was never just a flower. It was proof of loyalty. He bought what he needed, paid in polished shells, and made his way back through the market. Along the way, he passed a small boy selling single stems, wilted, uneven, clearly leftovers. No one stopped. The gardener did. "How much?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "Whatever it's worth to you." He handed over a few maize cakes, took the flower, and tucked it behind his ear. It drooped instantly. "Not your best work," he said softly. The boy laughed anyway. Back at the palace, the overseers inspected his purchases with the same enthusiasm one might give to inventorying rocks. "You'll plant these near the fountain," they said. "The emperor walks there at sunset." He nodded. He'd learned long ago not to argue with people who thought beauty was permanent. So he planted the lilies in neat rows, arranging them until they looked as if they'd grown there naturally, as if the earth had spontaneously decided to honor the emperor's footsteps. By dusk, his knees were sore and his hands smelled of sap. He paused to look at his work. It was perfect, of course. Perfect in that hollow, ceremonial way that perfection often is. And he thought about the flower sellers, their laughter, their weariness, their unspoken defiance. They grew the color that made emperors look divine, and yet none of their names would ever be remembered. Then again, neither would his. The sun slipped behind the mountains, turning the canals into rivers of fire. He watched the reflection of the lilies on the water's surface, how they quivered, fragile and golden, like small suns trying not to drown. He knew by morning half of them would wilt. That was the part no one saw, the quiet decay behind all splendor. The empire demanded beauty, but beauty demanded loss. He leaned back, elbows on his knees, and muttered to the flowers, "You'll fade by tomorrow. But at least tonight, you fooled the gods." A breeze stirred. Petals drifted into the water, spinning slowly away. He watched them go until the last trace of color disappeared into the dusk. Because in Tenochtitlan, nothing stayed perfect for long, except the illusion that it did. Chapter 9. Flowers for the End of Time. By the time the next moon rose, the palace gardens had become a battlefield, though not the kind with weapons. The gardeners were fighting against time itself. Every few weeks, the priests announced a festival, and the gardens had to transform overnight. The emperor, in his infinite need to remind the gods that he existed, required that every ceremony be more spectacular than the last. So the gardeners worked like quiet magicians, swapping entire fields of flowers before dawn, repainting reality to fit the calendar. This particular festival was for the renewal of the sun. The priests said the world was ending again, and it was the people's job to keep it spinning. It was the kind of casual cosmic threat that the Aztecs lived with daily. If the right offerings weren't made, if the right petals didn't fall in the right direction, everything, sky, water, life, might just dissolve back into darkness. No pressure. The gardener had spent the past 3 days preparing. Thousands of blossoms had been collected from the chinampas, sorted by color, and arranged into spirals that represented the motion of time. Gold for the dawn, red for blood, white for bones, blue for the eternal heavens. The priests walked among them, muttering blessings, occasionally reordering a pattern because a god didn't like the symmetry. The gardener didn't argue. He knew better than to reason with men who talked directly to the sun. As night fell, torches were lit around the garden's edges. The air shimmered with heat, incense, and that faint metallic scent that always accompanied ceremonies involving minor sacrifices, which, in Aztec terms, usually meant at least one human heart. He'd seen it before, of course. The gardeners were expected to stay nearby, tending the flowers used to decorate the altars. He didn't watch the sacrifices directly anymore. He'd learned to focus on the petals, the comparts. When the drums began, he scattered fresh marigolds on the path and kept his eyes low. The priests chanted. The drums echoed. Somewhere, a conch shell blared. The sound was too big, too ancient, like the earth trying to remember how to breathe. And then it stopped. Silence. Thick, unbroken. A single priest stepped forward and placed a garland of white lilies at the altar. The gardener recognized them instantly. They were his. He'd planted those lilies 2 weeks ago near the fountain. Now they crowned the ceremony meant to reset time itself. That was how it always went. The work of quiet hands ended up in the grip of gods. When the ceremony was finished, the priests left the garden. Only a few embers glowed in the torches, and the flowers, still perfect, looked ghostly in the dark. The gardener stayed behind, as he always did, to clean the petals that had fallen out of place. He swept them into a pile and watched how the wind immediately tried to scatter them again. It struck him how much the Aztecs seemed to be doing the same thing. Sweeping, arranging, praying, always trying to hold together what the universe was determined to scatter. He looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, the gods were allegedly pleased. But he couldn't help wondering what they did with all these offerings. Did they admire the patterns? Did they notice the colors? Or was it all just noise to them, like the hum of insects, constant and forgettable? He sighed, sat on the cool stone edge of a fountain, and dipped his hands in the water. The reflection shimmered, half moon, half face. He looked tired. He always looked tired. Maybe the world deserves to end, he murmured, just so we can stop replanting the same flowers. He smiled faintly at his own blasphemy. The gods could smite him later, if they were paying attention. The night deepened. The drums were gone. The stars were still. And in that perfect stillness, the garden felt like the only thing in the empire that didn't need to prove anything. By dawn, when the first rays cut through the mist, the petals that had been blessed by priests and blood alike were already wilting. Their edges curled inward, collapsing like the end of a dream. The gardener brushed a few from the path and thought, not for the first time, how fragile divine beauty always was. Then, quietly, he began to plant again. Because that's what everyone in Tenochtitlan did, in their own way, rebuild the world before it realized it was ending. The sun rose. The empire continued. The lilies bloomed again. And for one soft moment, the gardener almost believed it was enough. Chapter 10. The Garden of Secrets. The summons came at dawn, carried by a servant with the face of someone who'd been awake all night. The gardener was still half asleep, sipping at his morning atoll, when the boy bowed and murmured, "The emperor requires a private garden." The gardener blinked. "Another one?" The boy nodded gravely, as if such excess was a natural law. "This one is for her." He didn't have to ask who her was. Everyone in the palace knew. The emperor's newest favorite, young, beautiful, and, by all accounts, the kind of person whose existence caused an entire city's worth of women to develop quiet, mutual hatred. She was from a conquered province, barely 16, and rumor said she'd sung once before the emperor during a feast and somehow ended up with her own villa by the lake the next morning. Typical story. Power liked pretty things, and pretty things rarely stayed pretty for long. The gardener followed the servant through the maze of corridors, past stone courtyards and whispering attendants. The air smelled faintly of cacao and burnt copal. They reached the southern edge of the palace complex, where the lake lapped against the walls and a small island had been recently dredged from the water. Workers were already hauling soil and laying stones in neat terraces. "This," the servant said, gesturing grandly, "will be the floating garden of the moon." The gardener squinted. "It's more of a damp rectangle." The servant ignored him. "You'll oversee its creation. The emperor wants flowers that glow in the moonlight. Fragrant ones. Rare ones. The kind that make people forget to breathe." "Of course he does," the gardener muttered. By noon, he was standing knee-deep in mud, directing men to shape the foundations. The island was small, maybe the size of a marketplace stall, but the expectations were enormous. He needed to build not just a garden, but a story, something that looked effortless, that whispered love and power at the same time. He chose pale flowers, lilies, white dahlias, night-blooming jasmine. He mixed them with silver-green herbs that would shimmer in low light. Around the edges, he placed soft reeds and floating mats of moss, so that the garden would blur into the lake's reflection. He wanted it to feel uncertain, half dream, half earth. It took weeks. Every morning, he watched mist rise from the water as the first petals opened, and every evening he listened to the frogs begin their steady, sleepy chorus. Then, one twilight, she arrived. The emperor's favorite. She came in a canoe padded with cushions, draped in fine cotton dyed the color of the sky before rain. She was quiet, that was the first thing he noticed. Not shy, not humble, just quiet, as if she'd already seen how short-lived beauty could be. He bowed deeply. "My lady, the garden is ready." She stepped onto the path. The water rippled around her feet. Her eyes wandered over the blossoms, soft, deliberate, assessing. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Too beautiful." The gardener wasn't sure if that was praise or a warning. He kept his voice gentle. "The emperor wanted a place for you to find peace." She smiled faintly. "Peace isn't what he wants me to find." She walked among the flowers, touching them lightly. "Do you ever get tired," she asked, "of making things that die?" He hesitated. "Every day." Her gaze lingered on a patch of white marigolds. "Then you understand." That night, after she left, he stayed behind to tend the lanterns along the path. The moon rose high, washing everything in silver. The flowers seemed to glow, just as he'd promised. But somehow, the garden felt haunted, not by spirits, but by something quieter. Anticipation, maybe. Or doom. Over the next weeks, she returned often. Always alone. Sometimes she'd bring a book of poems, sometimes just sit and watch the water. The gardener pretended not to notice, though he couldn't help observing how she'd begun to pluck the petals of the lilies, one by one, letting them drift into the lake. Eventually, whispers began to circulate through the palace. The emperor had grown cold. Another favorite had appeared. The old story again. And the floating garden of the moon, once a symbol of devotion, was now a quiet corner no one dared mention. One morning, a different messenger came. "The emperor wants the island cleared," he said flatly. "New use. New order." The gardener nodded, but that night, he rode out alone. The moon hung low, pale and thin. The flowers were fading already. He sat in the middle of the island and let the silence wash over him. It was strange, he thought, how quickly beauty became a burden. How every gift in this city came with an expiration date. He looked at the last surviving lily, the one she had never touched, and whispered, "I'll leave you here. Someone should remember what this place was." Then he turned and rode back, leaving the island to its slow, inevitable sinking. By dawn, workers arrived with shovels and orders. They tore up the flowers, dumped the soil, and built a new platform for statues. The floating garden of the moon vanished from memory almost overnight. But sometimes, when the lake was still, the gardeners swore they could see pale petals drifting just beneath the surface, like ghosts of things once adored. and the gardener never quite stopped looking for them. Chapter 11. When the gods grew silent. The city woke one morning to a strange hush. Even the usual rattle of paddles across Lake Texcoco seemed muted. Market sellers called faintly to empty streets. The priests ran their rituals, but the sky refused to respond. Rain clouds hovered, heavy and gray, but no drops fell. The canals shimmered under the sun, but their waters felt stagnant. For the gardener, it was a subtle alarm. The empire thrived on signs, on messages read in the patterns of nature. Drought was a language. Silence from the gods was punctuation, the kind that left everyone tense, mouths dry, and hands trembling over prayers. He rose at first light and made his way through the palace terraces. The emperor's gardens, so meticulously arranged, seemed unnervingly still. Petals drooped. Leaves curled. Even the water in the reflecting pools had lost its sparkle. Normally, a lack of vigor would be blamed on the gardener. But this was different. Priests were pacing, muttering, rearranging altars as if the right combination of stones and incense could summon rain. And yet the sky remained indifferent. The gardener did what he always did. He moved through the floating beds, trimming, pruning, adjusting. He whispered encouragement to the maize, coaxed the amaranth to stand taller, and offered a soft apology to the lilies that sagged under the relentless sun. He thought about the paradox. The gods had built the city through devotion and sacrifice, yet now they were quiet. Did they sleep? Were they offended? Or had they grown tired of being asked to approve every bloom, every harvest, every breath of wind? By midday, the effects were visible everywhere. Floating gardens began to sag. Canals stank from heat. Fish floated to the surface. Even the ornamental birds in palace aviaries seemed restless. Merchants arrived, worried, speaking of dry crops in far provinces. Tribute caravans had stalled. The empire's food network, so delicate and interdependent, was showing the strain. The emperor, naturally, was displeased. But displeasure in Tenochtitlan was always filtered through ritual. Priests ordered offerings. The emperor inspected gardens, even sending the gardener himself to float lilies and marigolds across sacred pools as if the act itself could coax divine favor. The gardener obeyed, moving silently through the temple terraces, scattering flowers that seemed almost to sigh as they touched the water. They were beautiful, of course, perfect petals in perfect arcs, but the life within them was fading. At night, he would sit by the canals, listening to the chirping of insects and the faint hum of distant drums. The city slept fitfully, and he, who tended beauty for gods and rulers alike, began to feel a creeping helplessness. For the first time, he realized that no amount of care, no whispering prayer, no rearrangement of blossoms could compel a silent deity to act. He thought of the past gardens, the floating garden of the moon, the emperor's lilies, the medicinal herbs tended by healers, all of them now dwarfed by the weight of drought and divine indifference. Even the floating beds, his proudest creations, felt temporary, fragile, laughably inadequate against forces he could neither control nor predict. In this stillness, he began to understand something he had avoided thinking for years. The gardens were never truly his. They belonged to gods, emperors, and memory itself. And when the gods went silent, all human effort felt like a whisper in a storm. Yet he continued, out of habit, out of stubbornness, out of that quiet, patient knowledge that even failing at tending life was better than doing nothing. He pruned, watered where he could, whispered to plants that would almost certainly wilt before dawn. And the sun beat down. The wind refused to carry clouds. The lake lay heavy and still. The empire, for all its wealth and ritual, had stumbled into uncertainty, and the gardener, invisible and enduring, remained the silent witness to its fragile persistence. By dusk, he sat on the palace steps, hands muddy, knees sore, and reflected on the strange cruelty of devotion, that even when one labored perfectly, there was no guarantee the gods, or humans, would notice. But morning would come again, and he would rise, as always, to meet it, because in Tenochtitlan, the gardens, the empire, and the gods themselves were never truly in control. Only the gardeners persisted. Chapter 12. Desperate measures in the gardens. the drought persisted. Days bled into one another under a relentless sun, the lake's surface cracking in shallow patches, and the canals whispering complaints of stagnation. The city itself seemed to sag under the heat, stone terraces radiating warmth that made every step a slow surrender to exhaustion. And through it all, the gardener moved like a shadow, hands dark with mud, knees slick from water scarcity, eyes scanning for any sign of life. He had begun experimenting. Small, cautious measures at first, adjusting the flow of irrigation channels to concentrate water on the most delicate plants, shading terraces with mats woven from reeds, mulching the beds with layers of damp moss he had secretly scavenged from distant canals. Each method carried risk. Too much shade, and the flowers wouldn't bloom. Too little water, and they would die. He whispered to them constantly. Not prayers, there was little point, but gentle urgings, like a parent coaxing a sick child to rise from bed. The amaranth, the cacao, the lilies, each received its own counsel. He moved deliberately, rhythmically, trying to impart calm to roots that could not feel it. By the third day, he noticed subtle signs of success. Leaves perked slightly, petals remained uncurled. A few insects returned to pollinate flowers that had begun to forget how to thrive. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Even the gods might have noticed, though he doubted it. But the city's unrest grew. Priests, unable to command rain, grew tense. They demanded larger offerings, louder chants, more elaborate ceremonies. And the emperor, already anxious from empty canals and delayed tributes, insisted on visible signs of life in the gardens, because a ruler without flourishing flora looked weak. So the gardener pushed further. He began experimenting with hybrid planting, mixing species in ways that would have been considered reckless before. Herbs with lilies, amaranth with small flowering shrubs, even floating mats that combined edible plants with ornamental blooms. The combinations were unusual, unpredictable. Some thrived. Some died spectacularly, collapsing into the canals with a quiet splash. He watched the survivors closely. Their resilience became a kind of secret language between him and the gardens, the whispered acknowledgement that life would endure even when divinity had grown silent. He also began recycling water with meticulous care, siphoning it from small pools left stagnant in the floating beds and redistributing it to young shoots. It was tedious, humiliating work, but necessary. The empire had not yet noticed the gardener's quiet heroism. They only saw blossoms when they were perfect, thriving, obedient. And yet, there were moments of small satisfaction. The lilies that bloomed in moonlight, the herbs that retained their scent despite the heat, even the stubborn amaranth that refused to bend, all of it whispered reassurance that persistence, patience, and ingenuity could keep life alive against odds that seemed cosmic. At dusk, he would pause by the canals and watch reflections of dying petals drifting across water that had survived his ministrations. He allowed himself brief thoughts of pride, tempered by humility. He knew better than to assume success was permanent. Tomorrow or the day after, the drought could return with renewed cruelty. Still, he continued, because in the Aztec world, to do nothing was not an option. Gods might ignore the suffering of humans. The emperor might demand perfection. But a gardener, even a lowly one, could still coax life from mud, water, and stubborn roots. That, at least, was within his control. Night after night, he lingered beside the floating beds, listening to the faint hum of surviving insects, counting petals that refused to fall, murmuring to plants in languages the world didn't recognize. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that survival was measured in tiny victories, almost invisible to everyone else. And as the first stars appeared above Tenochtitlan, glittering over the still lake, he finally allowed himself to rest, tired, mud-streaked, and quietly triumphant. Because for now, life endured, and the gardens still whispered that beauty could persist even in silence. Chapter 13, Courting Foreign Eyes. The arrival of foreign envoys was always announced with fanfare that made the palace gardens feel claustrophobic. Drums echoed across Lake Texcoco, banners snapped in the wind, and messengers scurried like ants to ensure everything looked impressive. The emperor wanted to project abundance, stability, and divine favor. even if the sun had scorched half the city and the canals smelled faintly of decay. For the gardener, this was an unwelcome complication. He had been managing scarcity quietly for weeks, coaxing life from stubborn roots and rationed water, and now he was being asked to stage abundance as if nothing were amiss. The envoys themselves arrived in ceremonial canoes, brightly painted and laden with their own tributes: feathers, cacao, jade, and small animals for display. Their leaders were adorned in gold and cloth so fine it seemed to float above their skin. They spoke little, observing, calculating, judging the empire's capacity for wealth and taste. The gardener moved through the floating gardens like a ghost, repositioning blossoms so that every terrace seemed lush, every pool shimmering, every pathway perfectly symmetrical. He arranged lilies and dahlias with care, propped floating mats of herbs to conceal dying leaves, and even added a few fresh petals from hidden stores to make the fountains appear overflowing. No one noticed the subtle panic in his hands, the sweat streaking his brow, or the faint tremor in the blooms that were barely surviving. To the world, it looked effortless, exactly as it was meant to. The emperor himself walked among the envoys, gesturing at terraces, pools, and floating beds, praising the gardens in carefully measured tones. "See," he said, voice calm, "how the earth obeys our will. How life thrives beneath the blessings of the gods." The gardener swallowed a groan. Life was thriving because of his own desperate, invisible labor, and perhaps because the sun had been merciful enough to allow a few stubborn blooms to survive. But no one would know that. Not the priests, not the envoys, not even the emperor. The illusion of control was enough. He noticed one envoy leaning close to inspect a flower, a rare white lily that had survived the drought through careful water rationing and whispered encouragement. The envoy's eyes widened. "It blooms in such perfection," he murmured. The gardener bowed slightly, though he remained silent. The flower's perfection was temporary, fragile, maintained only by nerves, sweat, and constant attention. One misstep, one drying wind, and it would droop. He alone bore that quiet knowledge. Throughout the day, he moved from bed to bed, replenishing petals, rotating plants for optimal sunlight, and whispering gentle instructions to herbs and blooms alike. To any observer, it was routine care. To him, it was survival theater. By dusk, the envoys had been impressed. They praised the garden's bounty, the emperor's attention to detail, and the harmony between human effort and divine favor. They left satisfied, carrying their own gifts and reports to distant lands. The gardener watched them go, a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. The gardens had performed, obedient, beautiful, unflinching. And yet, behind the veneer, the plants had suffered, water had been hoarded, petals had been propped, and life had been forced into compliance with appearances. Night fell. He walked alone among the terraces, listening to the faint croak of frogs and the whisper of wind through leaves. He allowed himself a brief moment of honesty. For all the grandeur, all the display, all the careful perfection the emperor demanded, the gardens existed only because someone unseen, fought tirelessly against decay. He knelt by a small bed of marigolds, brushing his fingers along the resilient petals. "You've survived the scrutiny," he murmured. "But tomorrow it will be different. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again, and the work begins anew." And so it always did. In Tenochtitlan, beauty and survival were inseparable, but not the same. One could appear eternal, while the other quietly endured under hands darkened with mud. The gardener, as always, remained the silent witness, tending life, managing illusion, and keeping the empire's fragile bloom afloat, one painstaking petal at a time. Chapter 14. The Weight of Seasons. The seasons arrived quietly in Tenochtitlan, though no less insistently than the empire's demands. The sun climbed higher, the rains became more erratic, and the lake's edge receded in slow, stubborn retreat. For the gardener, each day was now an intricate negotiation with inevitability. He knew the rhythms of plants, of soil, of water, but the city demanded more than survival. It demanded spectacle, consistency, and divine approval. The approaching festival of Tlaxcalquimco, the festival of flowers, made the pressure unbearable. The emperor expected terraces overflowing with blooms, fountains sparkling with petals, and fragrant pathways that whispered devotion to both gods and subjects. And yet, the drought had left much of the gardens wilted, sun-cracked, and trembling. He rose before dawn and walked the terraces, inspecting every floating bed. Leaves curled like weary hands, blossoms drooped as though in despair. He muttered soft apologies, adjusted stems, sprinkled water with measured care. Each action was deliberate, not for himself, but for the illusion of life that the empire required. He called the workers, quietly directing their movements. Some plants were to be rotated, others to be hidden behind stone screens. He experimented with shading delicate petals using mats of reed and palm, and redistributed water from one terrace to another, a delicate balancing act that would determine which blooms survived long enough for the festival. By mid-morning, he had established a rhythm. Hands muddy, knees aching, he moved like a conductor over an orchestra of fragile life. The marigolds glowed, the dahlias held firm, and the lilies caught the light with a fleeting brilliance. The illusion was perfect, though he knew the truth. Much of the garden was exhausted, barely holding itself together. He paused at a corner bed of herbs, many of them cracked and curling in the heat. He whispered to them, as he often did, urging them to endure, to live long enough to serve their purpose in offerings and medicines. For a moment, he imagined the garden as a living entity, capable of understanding human words. Perhaps it did. Perhaps that was the only thing keeping it alive. The festival arrived with a muted fanfare. Priests chanted, drummers beat steady rhythms, and torches flickered along the terraces. The emperor walked through the gardens, followed by attendants, dignitaries, and masked dancers. Every eye was on the blooms, and for a few hours, the illusion of perfection held. Petals remained upright, fountains sparkled, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and marigold. The gardener moved silently through the shadows, adjusting, replacing, coaxing. He was invisible, unnoticed, the quiet hand behind every successful impression. Even the emperor's gaze passed over him without recognition, as if he were part of the scenery. And perhaps he was. Night fell, and the festival ended. The guests departed, leaving torches flickering in the wind and the city to its quiet. The gardener lingered, inspecting petals that had already begun to curl, stems that drooped despite his care. He understood that tomorrow he would begin again, repositioning, shading, watering, a cycle dictated by seasons, duty, and fragile life. He knelt beside the canal, brushing water over petals in small, deliberate motions. The reflection of stars shimmered on the surface, fractured by ripples from floating lilies. He murmured softly, "Live long enough to be seen. And then, when no one watches, endure anyway." In Tenochtitlan, the seasons were relentless, the festivals demanding, and the gods unpredictable. But the gardener, tireless and quiet, continued his work, ensuring that beauty survived just long enough for the empire to believe it was eternal. Chapter 15. The Silent Invaders. The morning began with an uneasy stillness. The air was heavy, and the usual chorus of frogs and birds was muted, as though even the wildlife sensed the coming challenge. The gardener stepped onto the terraces, carefully scanning the floating beds, and froze. Tiny, black insects crawled across leaves and stems in subtle waves, almost imperceptible at first. Aphids, he realized, though the priests would call them agents of divine test or omens of decay. The infestation had arrived quietly, but it was merciless. Within hours, petals curled, leaves yellowed, and delicate herbs began to shrivel under the relentless attack. He knelt, examining the damage. His hands, darkened with the soil of 100 gardens, hovered over the leaves. There were no prayers that could stop this. No chants, no whispers, no careful placement of blossoms. Nature was reclaiming control, and he was left scrambling to negotiate. He summoned the workers, issuing silent instructions and moving quickly to improvise. Floating mats were separated, infested leaves removed, and herbal concoctions, bitter-smelling pastes made from crushed leaves and ash, were applied to deter the insects. He whispered encouragement to the surviving plants, though he knew they could not understand him. It was ritual as much as intervention. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, beating down on his back and shoulders. Sweat streaked his face, mingling with mud and sap. The insects seemed relentless, multiplying faster than he could respond. Each bed required meticulous attention, every decision critical. He rotated blossoms, mixed protective herbs into the water, and removed any debris that could serve as breeding grounds. By afternoon, a pattern began to emerge. Some beds responded, showing small signs of recovery. Others succumbed entirely, their petals shriveling and floating into the canals like tiny, defeated suns. He let them go, dragging them out of the main paths so the emperor and visiting dignitaries wouldn't notice. In the Aztec Empire, appearances were sacred. Reality was negotiable. He paused briefly to catch his breath and observed the empire around him. Priests carried incense through the palace corridors. Attendants whispered instructions. The emperor himself walked past the floating gardens, his gaze fixed on the thriving terraces, oblivious to the chaos beneath. The illusion of perfection had to be maintained, no matter the cost. By evening, the gardener had managed to contain most of the infestation. The surviving beds glowed faintly in the golden light, a testament to relentless care, ingenuity, and stubborn endurance. He inspected each one carefully, moving petals and leaves to create symmetry where none naturally existed. The garden seemed alive again, though he knew it was fragile, a precarious balance of survival and appearance. He sat at the edge of the canal, exhausted, watching the sun dip behind the temples. Tiny insects still clung to the remaining leaves, reminders that life was never fully controllable. He whispered to them as he often did to the plants. "Survive, even if it kills me trying." And as the evening breeze swept across the water, rustling leaves and petals, he understood something essential. The empire depended on illusion, but life depended on quiet vigilance. One could manage appearances for the emperor, the priests, and the gods. But the real work, the work of survival, was invisible. The night settled over Tenochtitlan. The canals reflected the stars, and the floating gardens, battered but intact, seemed to shimmer faintly. The gardener, mud-streaked, weary, and unwavering, lay back on a small stone ledge. His eyes traced constellations. The empire would demand more. The sun would rise again, pests would return, and storms might fail. But for now, life had endured. And for a gardener, that was enough.
Chapter 16. The Whisper of Sickness. The morning air was crisp but tinged with unease. Something was wrong, though it was subtle at first, the kind of wrong that only someone who spent their days leaning close to leaves could detect. A slight discoloration here, a faint curling there, a whisper of decay beneath the vibrant surface. The gardener moved through the floating terraces with deliberate care. His fingers traced the edges of marigolds, dahlias, and night-blooming jasmine. He knelt beside a prized patch of white lilies, the ones that had survived the drought, the pests, and every imperial scrutiny. And there it was, a faint mottling on the petals, veins beginning to darken, a soft sag that no amount of water could fix. Disease. It was small at first, easily dismissible if one were inattentive. But the gardener knew better. In Aztec gardens, sickness spread quietly, relentlessly, like gossip among courtiers. One infected plant could ruin a bed, a terrace, even a floating island. The stakes were more than botanical. The emperor demanded perfection, and imperfection could reflect on every gardener, attendant, and priest involved. He moved quickly, inspecting each bed, each floating mat. Signs of rot appeared in scattered patches. Herbs drooped, petals shriveled, and roots seemed weak. He frowned, assessing the extent. The disease was subtle but insidious. Left unchecked, it could undo weeks of careful labor. Turning to his collection of remedies, he prepared poultices from crushed leaves, aromatic herbs, and clay. He whispered instructions to the plants as he applied them, tapping veins, brushing soil away from stems, moving infected leaves to isolated containers. Every motion was precise, deliberate, a dance of desperation and hope. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, scorching terraces and floating beds alike. Workers brought fresh soil, and he carefully layered it around infected roots to encourage regeneration. He rotated plants to maximize airflow, sprinkled ash to ward off further rot, and applied carefully measured doses of herbal infusions, hoping that centuries of accumulated knowledge would suffice against this unseen adversary. Despite his meticulous efforts, not all plants survived. Some beds he had nurtured for months, lilies, dahlias, herbs, wilted and had to be removed. Each loss weighed on him quietly, like small betrayals. The emperor would see only the result, perfect arrangements in the ceremonial areas. But the gardener knew the truth. The labor, the careful tending, the whispered guidance had battled disease daily, often invisibly. By evening, the surviving beds showed small signs of recovery. Leaves perked slightly, petals uncurled just enough to catch fading sunlight. He brushed water across the surfaces, murmuring, "Live just long enough to be admired." He leaned back, arms muddy, and looked over the floating gardens. The disease had reminded him of the fragility of beauty, the impermanence of effort, and the constant vigilance demanded by both nature and empire. Even as Tenochtitlan thrived in appearance, its lifeblood, water, earth, labor, and careful attention, was tenuous, always on the edge. At night, he lit a small lamp and traced the reflection of the floating terraces in the water. Petals drifted lazily across the surface, a mixture of surviving blossoms and remnants of failure. He sighed softly, a sound almost swallowed by the calm of the lake. Tomorrow he would rise and tend again. Disease would return. The sun would rise hotter. And the emperor would demand beauty, abundance, perfection. But for now, in the quiet shadows of the palace terraces, he allowed himself a moment of recognition. Life, however fragile, had persisted. And in Tenochtitlan, persistence was the only true measure of devotion. Chapter 17. Inspection Day. The sun rose sluggishly over Tenochtitlan, throwing long, thin shafts of light across the palace terraces. Today was Inspection Day, the day the emperor himself would walk through the gardens, accompanied by senior priests, palace officials, and a rotating cast of attendants tasked with recording every detail. Even the smallest blemish, the slightest wilt, could draw scrutiny, subtle or otherwise. For the gardener, this was a day of quiet dread. He arrived before dawn, moving through the terraces like a shadow, checking every floating bed, every fountain, every patch of moss. Disease had been partially contained, but traces lingered, a curled leaf here, a drooping petal there. Water was rationed to keep the plants upright, but not so much as to leave puddles that could suggest carelessness. It was an exacting balance, and the gardener had learned that appearances were far more critical than reality. The palace staff bustled around him, arranging flowers in precise arcs and adjusting stones to reflect symmetry from the emperor's vantage points. The gardener directed them with quiet authority, ensuring that floating mats were aligned, herbs didn't overgrow, and blossoms were positioned to catch the early sunlight just so. Every moment was calculated, every movement deliberate. When the emperor arrived, the garden seemed to have transformed overnight. Lilies and marigolds gleamed, dahlias stood proudly, and the air carried a fragrance carefully balanced between overwhelming and subtle. To the untrained eye, Tenochtitlan's gardens were perfect, a living symbol of order, divine favor, and imperial taste. The emperor moved slowly along the terraces, speaking to priests and attendants, nodding at the arrangement of blooms, and occasionally touching a petal with fingers that had seen decades of power. The gardener stayed at the periphery, adjusting petals or propping stems when the emperor's gaze passed too closely. Every step required vigilance. A single droop, a blemish, a stray leaf could betray the painstaking labor that had gone unseen. Halfway through the inspection, a minor calamity occurred. A small patch of night-blooming jasmine, previously thriving, began to wilt rapidly under the morning sun. The gardener moved swiftly, brushing away leaves, adjusting stems, and carefully pouring water at the base. The moment passed without notice, but his chest tightened. One small lapse, one minor imperfection, and the illusion of abundance would crumble. The emperor continued, oblivious, praising symmetry, scent, and color. Priests murmured blessings under their breath, cataloging the arrangement of every plant. Officials whispered observations, their eyes darting between blossoms and water features, recording the empire's health in botanical terms. By midday, the inspection concluded. The emperor departed, satisfied, leaving behind an air of approval that felt both heavy and fragile. The palace staff relaxed slightly, and the gardeners allowed themselves shallow breaths. The illusion had held. The gardener walked through the terraces alone, inspecting petals, adjusting leaves, and removing anything that had begun to show strain. The sun was high, the shadows sharp, and the heat relentless. He paused at a small canal, watching petals drift on the water's surface. So much labor, so many small victories, and all for an illusion that would dissolve within days.
Yet he continued. Because Tenochtitlan required perfection, the emperor demanded beauty, and the gods, though silent, were still owed respect. And the gardener, tireless and unseen, remained the custodian of both life and illusion, the fragile line between survival and spectacle. He knelt beside the floating beds, whispering softly to each blossom, "Hold fast. Hold long enough to be admired, and then endure even when no one watches." Night descended, the terraces cooling, the canals reflecting pale stars. The gardener leaned back on a stone ledge, letting exhaustion wash over him. Inspection day had passed, perfection had been maintained, and the city had continued as if nothing had strained, wilted, or struggled. But the gardener knew the truth. Beneath every successful facade was constant labor, endless vigilance, and the quiet persistence of those who understood that beauty, like life, demanded attention, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And in Tenochtitlan, the work never ended. Chapter 18. The storm approaches. The morning was deceptive. A faint wind rustled through the terraces, carrying an unusual heaviness that made even the birds hesitate. The sun rose bright, but the gardener noticed the clouds, low, rolling, gray with the promise of something more than rain. The storm, he realized, was coming. And not just any storm, one that could undo weeks of labor, wash away carefully arranged petals, and flatten the floating beds he had coaxed into life. He moved quickly, scanning every terrace, every floating island. The lilies that had survived drought and disease now trembled under the anticipation of water, their stems bending with the weight of anxious clouds. Dahlias braced themselves, petals tight against gusts, and marigolds leaned awkwardly, unsure which way to fall. The gardener issued silent commands to workers: secure the floating mats, reinforce terraces with stones, tie down fragile stems, and prune anything that could be torn from its roots. He even moved some of the rarest blossoms to sheltered areas, improvising small canopies with reeds and woven mats. Every action was urgent, precise, a dance with forces beyond his control. By midday, the clouds thickened. The light dimmed, turning the palace terraces into muted pools of shadow. The wind picked up, slicing across canals and lifting petals into trembling flight. He walked among the beds, adjusting, propping, whispering to flowers that could not respond. The first drops fell as a gentle percussion on the stone walkways. The gardener paused, letting the rhythm of rain guide his movements. It was beautiful, in a way, life returning after weeks of drought, but he knew better than to trust beauty in its first blush. The storm would intensify, and every drop could become a threat. He moved to the floating beds, checking moorings and reinforcing connections between mats. Leaves were tied together to prevent tearing, herbs buried more deeply to avoid being washed away, petals carefully weighed down with small stones where necessary. The water in the reflecting pools began to ripple, small waves threatening to topple nearby blossoms. The wind grew stronger. A swirl of dust and petals filled the air. He ducked beneath a partially collapsed canopy, adjusting supports, muttering apologies to plants that had survived everything else: drought, disease, inspection, pests, only to face this sudden fury. Hours passed. The storm raged, torrential rain mixing with gusting wind. Petals flew, mats shifted, and the canals overflowed slightly, threatening to sweep delicate blossoms into the depths. Yet, by careful attention and swift improvisation, the gardener preserved the majority of the floating gardens. Some beds were lost, some petals scattered, but the illusion of abundance endured. By nightfall, the storm moved on. The terraces were wet, gleaming in the pale moonlight. Water pooled in low spots, but the surviving beds reflected resilience, defiance, and meticulous care. The gardener stood amidst it all, soaked, exhausted, and mud-smeared, surveying the fragile victory. He leaned over a canal, brushing a few remaining petals back into place. "You've survived," he whispered to the flowers, "though you had every reason to fail. Hold on to that." The city seemed quieter now, the storm's aftermath leaving a sense of calm tinged with weariness. The emperor would arrive tomorrow for routine inspection, unaware of the night's chaos. The priests would bless the gardens, praising divine favor, oblivious to the gardener's quiet heroism. He knelt by the floating beds, brushing water across petals, aligning leaves, whispering encouragement. In Tenochtitlan, storms came and went, gods were silent, emperors demanded perfection, and beauty teetered on the edge of impermanence. Yet life endured, and the gardener, tireless and unseen, would endure with it, tending, coaxing, arranging, and whispering to the fragile, persistent world he alone understood. Chapter 19. Tribute and Temptation. The city stirred early, the usual haze of smoke and dust mingling with the faint scent of flowers. Today brought foreign tribute caravans, their long lines of pack animals, attendants, and merchants stretching along the causeways toward the palace. The emperor had decreed that the gardens be arranged to display abundance, to impress both subjects and envoys alike. The gardener felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the pressure to perform, to make life appear limitless, even when scarcity whispered beneath every terrace. The caravans arrived in a slow, measured procession. Brightly painted llamas carried exotic goods, baskets of cacao, jade ornaments, and feathers from distant regions. The envoys walked carefully, observing, calculating, noting the arrangement of flowers, the symmetry of terraces, the freshness of herbs and blossoms. Their eyes flickered to the canals, then to the reflecting pools, then to the terraces. Every gaze was a silent judgment. The gardener moved like a shadow among the terraces, adjusting petals, propping stems, and rotating floating mats to maintain the illusion of effortless beauty. The drought, the pests, the disease, all still whispered beneath the surface, but no one could perceive the struggle. All that mattered was the appearance of life, of abundance, of divine favor made visible through blooms. He focused first on the floating gardens near the palace's southern edge, where lilies, marigolds, and night-blooming jasmine shimmered against the canal's surface. These beds would draw the first attention of the envoys. He moved quickly, brushing petals into place, removing any that had begun to wilt, and carefully sprinkling water in measured amounts. The mats floated sturdily now, thanks to previous improvisations, but he remained vigilant. Even a minor shift could betray the labor hidden beneath the surface. The envoys arrived at the terraces, their murmurs polite but calculating. One of the younger attendants leaned close, whispering, "They expect this to be flawless. The emperor's reputation and our city's honor rides on what they see here." The gardener's hands worked without pause, adjusting, rotating, lifting. Flawless was impossible, but convincing that he could achieve. Every bloom that remained, every herb that retained its scent, was testimony to quiet labor and constant attention. Hours passed. The caravans delivered tribute to the emperor's court, while the gardeners worked ceaselessly behind the scenes. Some beds were reinforced with stones, others were shaded using improvised mats. He even moved small, delicate blossoms from one floating garden to another, masking the fact that scarcity had thinned their ranks. By midday, the envoys began their walk through the central terraces. They paused over beds of amaranth and lilies, commenting on color, arrangement, and symmetry. The gardener remained in shadow, unseen, adjusting the slightest irregularities. One misplaced petal or a drooping leaf could have undone weeks of labor, yet his careful, relentless work made the garden seem effortless, perfect. In the quiet moments between inspections, he allowed himself a private thought. The emperor and envoys were charmed by illusion, by the surface, by the idea of control. They could never see the sweat, the whispered coaxing, the constant vigilance required to keep life afloat in a city perched above water and under a merciless sun. Evening approached. The caravans departed, laden with the impression of abundance, their envoys satisfied, their reports ready to carry praise of the city's wealth, prosperity, and divine favor. The palace staff exhaled in relief, and the gardens, still standing, reflected moonlight on their fragile, floating mats. The gardener walked slowly along the terraces, brushing stray petals back into alignment, murmuring encouragement to those that had survived. The water was calm, the air cool, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of another crisis averted. But he knew the truth. Abundance was always fragile, beauty temporary, and the labor hidden from all eyes, save for his own. The city would continue to demand perfection, tribute would continue to arrive, and the emperor's expectations would never diminish. Yet, as he lingered by a still reflecting pool, hands muddy and heart quietly tired, he recognized a simple truth. The gardens endured because he endured, tending life where the rest of the empire saw only spectacle. And that, in the quiet of the terraces, was enough. Chapter 20. The Quiet Spread of Rot. The terraces smelled faintly of damp earth and moss, a reminder that even survival left traces. Weeks of drought, storms, pests, and relentless inspections had left the gardens vulnerable in ways no one else could see. And now, as the gardener moved among the floating beds, he noticed it. A subtle, almost imperceptible spread of rot along the edges of petals and stems, curling into the veins of leaves like whispered secrets. At first, he hesitated, kneeling beside a bed of lilies that had survived everything else. A few petals had darkened slightly, their edges soft and pliable under his fingers. The signs were faint, but he recognized them instantly: fungal growth, slow-moving yet relentless, creeping through soil and roots alike. This was not a catastrophe that announced itself in a crash or a cry. It was insidious, quiet, and patient. The gardener set to work immediately. He separated infected plants from healthy beds, carefully pruning away affected leaves and stems. Floating mats were moved to isolated areas, water carefully redirected to prevent spores from spreading. Herbs were crushed and infused into protective pastes, which he applied meticulously, hoping to halt the invisible invasion. Hours passed with almost ritualistic precision. He whispered apologies to each plant, as though his voice could slow the growth of decay. The sun climbed high, harsh and merciless, yet he worked steadily, never rushing, never panicking. Every movement was deliberate. A leaf shifted just so, a root pressed into fresh soil, a petal rotated to minimize dampness. Some beds responded. The herbs stiffened, the lilies regained a measure of firmness, and marigolds stubbornly held their color. Others, despite his care, succumbed, leaves curling and falling into the canals like pale confessions. He dragged them out quietly, setting them aside so that the emperor's gaze would never encounter the evidence of imperfection. By late afternoon, the gardens had stabilized, though not without losses. The rot had been contained but not eradicated. It was a temporary truce, one that required vigilance every hour, every breath, every careful step. He moved among the beds again, brushing away debris, adjusting mats, whispering encouragement. In the fading light, he paused to observe the reflection of the terraces in the canal. Floating petals glimmered like stars scattered across water, a fragile constellation of life surviving against relentless odds. He allowed himself a quiet smile. It was not triumph, not yet, but it was endurance. And in Tenochtitlan, endurance was everything. Night fell. The gardener sat on a stone ledge, hands muddy, knees sore, and watched the subtle shimmer of surviving blooms. The city slept fitfully around him, priests murmuring prayers to silent gods, the emperor dreaming of abundance, and foreign envoys counting tribute elsewhere. Yet the quietest hero of all remained, tending fragile life, balancing beauty against rot, vigilance against decay. Because in the empire, in the floating gardens, and in life itself, survival demanded persistence, quiet, invisible, and unwavering. And the gardener, tireless and unseen, persisted. Chapter 20. The quiet spread of rot. The terraces smelled faintly of damp earth and moss, a reminder that even survival left traces. Weeks of drought, storms, pests, and relentless inspections had left the gardens vulnerable in ways no one else could see. And now, as the gardener moved among the floating beds, he noticed it. A subtle, almost imperceptible spread of rot along the edges of petals and stems, curling into the veins of leaves like whispered secrets. At first, he hesitated, kneeling beside a bed of lilies that had survived everything else. A few petals had darkened slightly, their edges soft and pliable under his fingers. The signs were faint, but he recognized them instantly: fungal growth, slow-moving yet relentless, creeping through soil and roots alike. This was not a catastrophe that announced itself in a crash or a cry. It was insidious, quiet, and patient. The gardener set to work immediately. He separated infected plants from healthy beds, carefully pruning away affected leaves and stems. Floating mats were moved to isolated areas, water carefully redirected to prevent spores from spreading. Herbs were crushed and infused into protective pastes, which he applied meticulously, hoping to halt the invisible invasion. Hours passed with almost ritualistic precision. He whispered apologies to each plant, as though his voice could slow the growth of decay. The sun climbed high, harsh and merciless, yet he worked steadily, never rushing, never panicking. Every movement was deliberate. A leaf shifted just so, a root pressed into fresh soil, a petal rotated to minimize dampness. Some beds responded. The herbs stiffened, the lilies regained a measure of firmness, and marigolds stubbornly held their color. Others, despite his care, succumbed, leaves curling and falling into the canals like pale confessions. He dragged them out quietly, setting them aside so that the emperor's gaze would never encounter the evidence of imperfection. By late afternoon, the gardens had stabilized, though not without losses. The rot had been contained but not eradicated. It was a temporary truce, one that required vigilance every hour, every breath, every careful step. He moved among the beds again, brushing away debris, adjusting mats, whispering encouragement. In the fading light, he paused to observe the reflection of the terraces in the canal. Floating petals glimmered like stars scattered across water, a fragile constellation of life surviving against relentless odds. He allowed himself a quiet smile. It was not triumph, not yet, but it was endurance. And in Tenochtitlan, endurance was everything. Night fell. The gardener sat on a stone ledge, hands muddy, knees sore, and watched the subtle shimmer of surviving blooms. The city slept fitfully around him, priests murmuring prayers to silent gods, the emperor dreaming of abundance, and foreign envoys counting tribute elsewhere. Yet the quietest hero of all remained, tending fragile life, balancing beauty against rot, vigilance against decay. Because in the empire, in the floating gardens, and in life itself, survival demanded persistence, quiet, invisible, and unwavering. And the gardener, tireless and unseen, persisted. Chapter 22. The Festival of Maize. The days had grown longer, the sun climbing higher with each passing week, and the palace terraces seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. The Festival of Maize, Huitozatli, approached, a ceremony that celebrated fertility, harvest, and the blessings of the gods. The emperor demanded the gardens reflect the abundance he claimed to command, a living testament to divine favor. For the gardener, this was both a challenge and a relentless trial. He rose before dawn, moving among the floating beds, inspecting each cluster of plants with careful scrutiny. The lilies that had survived rot, drought, and storms now needed to be aligned perfectly with corn stalks, marigolds, and amaranth. Paths were measured, petals adjusted, herbs positioned to ensure fragrance carried correctly toward ceremonial altars. Every detail mattered. The illusion of perfection had to withstand both scrutiny and the passage of time during the festival. Water was scarce, despite recent rains. The gardener rationed carefully, ensuring each floating mat received enough to remain upright without risking puddles that could drown roots or betray overzealous care. Shading mats were adjusted to prevent sunburn on delicate petals, while soil was loosened and leveled to encourage symmetrical growth. Every action was deliberate, as though the terrace itself were a puzzle demanding constant attention. Workers moved in quiet coordination under his supervision, trimming, propping, and repositioning plants. Even the smaller details were important. Herbs had to release fragrance at just the right angle, flowers had to catch sunlight to highlight the color of the maize stalks, and floating mats needed to align with the reflection of temple walls in the canals. A misstep could ruin the visual harmony and draw subtle disapproval from the emperor. By mid-morning, the gardens had transformed. Lilies stood proudly beside tassels of corn, marigolds glowed orange and yellow, and herbs released a subtle, carefully balanced aroma. The terraces seemed alive, yet the gardener knew that life was tenuous. Beneath the illusion of abundance, plants strained against scarcity, fatigue, and the remnants of rot. The emperor and priests arrived for inspection. Their eyes swept across the terraces, noting symmetry, fragrance, and color. The gardener moved silently, unseen, adjusting petals and leaves whenever attention wandered elsewhere. Floating mats were rotated, fragile stems propped, and water added in careful increments. The illusion was flawless. Throughout the festival, visitors walked through the gardens, admiring the careful interplay of maize, flowers, and herbs. Children pointed to blossoms, officials whispered among themselves, and priests murmured blessings. The gardener observed quietly, noting which plants needed reinforcement, which mats threatened to shift, and which blooms could not endure further strain. By dusk, the festival reached its ceremonial peak. Offerings were placed on altars, dances performed, and prayers recited. The gardens had performed admirably, appearing abundant, vibrant, and obedient. The gardener allowed himself a small sigh of relief, though he knew the work was never truly done. Plants were fragile, water was limited, and the emperor's expectations remained constant. Night fell over Tenochtitlan, the terraces glowing faintly in torchlight. The gardener walked among the floating beds, brushing petals into alignment, whispering encouragement to those that had survived the day's strain. The city slept fitfully around him, but he remained vigilant, tending life where beauty and illusion converged. In the quiet, he murmured softly, "Endure for the festival. Endure for the eyes that admire. And when they leave, endure still." Because in the empire, amidst ceremonies, offerings, and the gaze of gods and rulers alike, survival was quiet, relentless, and entirely dependent on the persistence of those who understood the fragile balance between life and display. And the gardener, tireless, unseen, and unwavering, remained its quiet steward. Chapter 23: The Heat Waves Trial. The sun rose earlier than usual, spilling molten gold across the terraces and turning stone walkways into heated plates under bare feet. A subtle tremor ran through the floating gardens, not of the earth but of the plants themselves, leaves curling in protest, petals drooping, roots straining against drying soil. The gardener recognized it immediately. A heat wave had arrived, relentless and indifferent, threatening the fragile equilibrium he had so painstakingly maintained. He moved among the floating beds, hands muddy, shirt damp with sweat. Every plant bore the marks of the sun's unforgiving gaze. Lilies slightly scorched at the edges, marigolds drooping, herbs curling inward to conserve moisture. The terraces, carefully arranged for the festival, now seemed to plead silently for relief. Water was the first challenge. He rationed what little remained from the canals, carefully distributing it to the most vulnerable blooms. Every drop had to be measured. Too much and roots would rot, too little and leaves would wilt beyond repair. He worked methodically, checking each mat, turning petals to catch dew, and adjusting shading mats to protect delicate blossoms from the unrelenting glare. The workers moved at his instruction, improvising makeshift screens from woven reeds, moving fragile mats closer to cooler edges of canals, and pruning leaves that could not survive the stress. The gardener whispered constantly, coaxing life from the plants with murmurs of encouragement and apology, a ritual repeated countless times under harsher suns. Hours passed in a blur of precision. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off water and stone, magnifying heat across every terrace. He moved slowly, deliberately, understanding that rushing could cost fragile life. Even the smallest miscalculation, a shifted mat, a displaced petal, might undo weeks of labor and leave the gardens looking imperfect before the emperor's inspection. By mid-afternoon, signs of survival began to emerge. A lily that had seemed ready to collapse held its petals upright. A cluster of marigolds began to shimmer faintly in the heat, stems rigid against gravity. Herbs, though curled, maintained their scent and vitality. These small victories, almost imperceptible, were everything. The gardener paused by a canal, watching reflections ripple across floating mats. He realized that beauty and survival had never been entirely aligned. One could appear flawless while the other teetered on collapse. The city's inhabitants, the emperor, the priests, none of them would notice the stress hidden beneath petals and stems. But he did, and he would intervene again and again until the threat had passed. Evening approached, the sun dipping slightly, but the heat wave's remnants lingered stubbornly. He rotated beds to cooler positions, shaded delicate blossoms further, and applied measured water to the most desperate roots. Every action was deliberate, almost meditative, a careful choreography of survival in an indifferent world. As night fell, the terraces cooled slowly, reflecting moonlight across the canals. The gardener walked among the floating beds, adjusting leaves, aligning petals, and whispering softly, "You endured the sun. Hold long enough to greet tomorrow." In Tenochtitlan, heat waves came and went, festivals demanded perfection, and life was fragile, fleeting, and stubborn. And yet, through labor, vigilance, and whispered encouragement, the gardens survived, as did he, the quiet steward of impermanence. For the gardener, endurance was never optional. It was the only measure of devotion, and the only proof that life, however fragile, could persist against relentless odds. Chapter 24: Secrets Among the Lilies. The morning mist hung low over the canals, softening the harsh edges of stone terraces and shimmering across floating beds. The gardener moved quietly through the familiar paths, inspecting blooms and herbs with careful attention. It was in this hushed light, far from the emperor's gaze and the city's bustle, that he noticed something unusual: a hidden patch of aquatic plants tucked beneath a cluster of lilies, partially obscured by floating mats. He knelt beside them, brushing aside leaves and debris. Their forms were delicate, almost translucent, with slender stems that swayed gently in the water. Small flowers, pale, ethereal, and fragile, peeked from beneath the canopy of lilies. He recognized them immediately, rare species, prized for both ceremonial use and subtle fragrance, yet notoriously difficult to cultivate. Their discovery was a quiet miracle, a secret tucked within the broader chaos of the floating gardens. But with opportunity came challenge. These plants required precise care, constant attention to water levels, protection from sun and wind, and careful monitoring for pests or disease. Even a minor misstep could destroy them. The gardener's chest tightened at the thought. Weeks of vigilance, months of careful management, and now these hidden treasures demanded yet another layer of diligence. He began work immediately, adjusting the floating mats to allow filtered sunlight, redirecting water to maintain a delicate current around the roots, and pruning surrounding lilies that threatened to overshadow them. Every motion was deliberate, almost reverent. These plants could not fail. They were too rare, too delicate, and too significant in the hidden language of the gardens. Hours passed. The gardener moved methodically, attending first to the hidden patch, then circling back to the main terraces to ensure nothing had shifted, wilted, or begun to succumb to rot. Sweat dampened his back. His hands were dark with mud, yet he felt a faint surge of excitement. Hidden wonders like this reminded him that the gardens held mysteries beyond imperial expectation, secrets that only someone who moved quietly among the floating beds could witness. He whispered to the aquatic plants, as he often did to others, "Survive here. Survive unseen. And in your persistence, remind me why this labor matters." By afternoon, the terraces were stabilized. The rare aquatic blooms swayed gently, their petals catching filtered sunlight in a fragile display of beauty. The gardener allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. These plants would endure, at least for now, because he had seen them, understood their needs, and intervened when necessary. Evening arrived, and the city's sound receded into distant murmurs. He walked the terraces slowly, adjusting petals, propping stems, and ensuring that the hidden patch remained untouched by casual observation. In Tenochtitlan, beauty could be public, but survival often required secrecy, patience, and tireless care. He paused beside the canal, watching reflections ripple across floating mats. The hidden aquatic plants swayed gently, like whispers beneath the lilies. He smiled faintly, mud-streaked and exhausted, knowing that the city would never see this miracle. But he would. And that, in the quiet of the terraces, was enough. Because for the gardener, tending life was not only about appearances. It was about persistence, hidden triumphs, and the small victories that unfolded far from the eyes of emperors, priests, and envoys alike. And so, amidst floating beds, whispering canals, and unseen blooms, he continued, quietly, tirelessly, and unwaveringly, steward of a fragile, secret world that only he could preserve. Chapter 25. The Cold Snap. The morning arrived unexpectedly sharp, a thin chill cutting through the usually warm air of Tenochtitlan. Mist rose from the canals, clinging to leaves and stems like delicate threads of silver, and the floating gardens seemed to shiver in response. The gardener, long accustomed to the city's rhythms, recognized the subtle signs immediately. An early cold snap, rare but capable of devastating even the most carefully tended beds. He moved quickly across the terraces, hands already numb from dew-soaked air. The lilies, marigolds, and delicate aquatic plants were vulnerable, their stems stiffening, petals curling against the bite of chill. The work that had survived drought, storms, pests, disease, and heat now faced an entirely different threat, cold that could undo months of effort in a matter of hours. Improvisation became urgent. He instructed workers to gather mats and reeds, weaving temporary canopies to shield the most sensitive blooms. Floating beds were rotated closer to the sun's weak rays, and fragile herbs were nestled among sturdier plants for shared warmth. Even water was manipulated, careful channels maintained to prevent freezing or stagnation. Every action required precision. The line between survival and disaster was finer than a petal's edge. As the sun climbed higher, the chill persisted stubbornly. The gardener knelt beside the rare aquatic patch hidden beneath the lilies, brushing leaves gently, whispering encouragement. These plants had survived neglect and secrecy, but they were fragile in ways that demanded constant attention. He adjusted mats, ensured sunlight reached each bloom, and checked roots for early signs of frost damage. One miscalculation could destroy months of delicate care. By midday, signs of endurance began to appear. Lilies that had stiffened regained some flexibility, marigolds perked slightly, and the aquatic plants swayed with cautious resilience. It was not a return to perfection. Some leaves were browned, petals slightly curled, but life had survived. Each small recovery was a victory, a quiet testament to vigilance and patience. The city carried on obliviously. Priests chanted in distant temples, attendants scurried with offerings, and the emperor remained unaware of the fragile drama unfolding on terraces below. Only the gardener moved with deliberate, slow urgency, balancing warmth, water, and sunlight to coax life back from the brink. As evening approached, the chill finally began to lift, replaced by the softer warmth of a fading sun. The terraces glimmered, dew sparkling on leaves, petals adjusting to the gentler air. He walked slowly, brushing stray leaves into alignment, whispering to each plant, "You have endured the cold. Hold through the night, and tomorrow will bring warmth again." Night fell over Tenochtitlan, canals reflecting faint starlight, and the floating gardens, battered but resilient, shimmered quietly. The gardener leaned back against a stone ledge, exhausted but vigilant, aware that the empire demanded beauty, the gods demanded devotion, and life demanded persistence. In this city of floating terraces, impermanence was constant, but so too was the quiet triumph of endurance. And the gardener, tireless, unseen, and unwavering, remained its steadfast steward.